You're listening to Summit Church, where faith comes alive and Jesus is at the center. For more information, go to our website at wearesummit.ca or find us on socials. Thanks for connecting, and stay watching for this week's message.
Just to remind you, we'll jump into the passage in a second, but as we look through these encounters of Jesus with people, there's three things in particular. There's kind of a framework we're using to dig deeper into the passage so that we get things out of it. The first thing is that whenever we see Jesus interacting with people, treating people in a particular way, we have this belief that Jesus himself said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Whenever we see him in his character, he's revealing the character of God. So the way that we observe he deals with people tells us something about God's character and his heart and his compassion. The second thing we often see in these interactions is how people respond to Jesus. And that can inform us or inspire us in how they respond to either perhaps take that on ourselves in the way that we respond to Jesus, or perhaps sometimes stay away from certain traps that people got into in the way they responded to Jesus. And thirdly, we have this concept in Scripture that we see in the New Testament that we're not just called to follow Jesus, but also to reflect him and to be ambassadors of him and represent him in the world around us. And so that's another thing we want to pick out when we look at these passages, is to see how can we then, like Jesus, respond to this person in this story. How can we represent him to people around us? You good with that? You don't have a choice. You just Right. So, all that in mind, let's turn together to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 20, and we're going to read from verses 24 to 29. I'll give you a few moments to do that. You can, if you feel like it, you can give me a little whoop of joy when you found it. Or if you're really Pentecostal, hallelujah, something like that. Okay, so if you're there, you'll probably see already kind of the person we're talking about. This is Jesus and Thomas, starting verse 24. It says that now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the..." And place my finger into the mark of the nails and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." One of the things about this passage is that I believe that, and this is a soft spot for me in terms of like this person of Thomas in this passage, we've labeled him Doubting Thomas. I don't know why. There's something about our culture, and I hope it's not really embedded in our Christian culture too much, but I think there's something to be said about defining a person by essentially their worst moment. But for the entire of Christian history, like that Thomas has been labeled Doubting Thomas just because of this one particular moment. You know, even his name has been used to kind of like label other people. "Oh, you're just being a Doubting Thomas." What a tragedy that we would define somebody by a moment like that. You know, that ignores a number of things that we know about Thomas, because in this passage in particular, there's something that's called Thomas's good confession, the good confession, "My Lord and my God." He is one of the first disciples to actually confess that openly to Jesus. And then earlier in John 11, Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem, and they all have this realization, the disciples, that he's probably going to die there because he's going to be persecuted, and the authorities are going to capture him and crucify him. And what's Thomas's response to that is like, let us also go with him that we might die also. Thomas was ready to give it all. But what a tragedy that we ignore those things and focus on the one thing about him that was perhaps a negative thing. But I want to just dig into that a little bit more, because I think we can learn a lot from Thomas's example. And I believe that John thought that too as he wrote the gospel. Because there's something about this passage in the way that it's placed in John's gospel that is good to notice. Because right after this, if you're still in your Bibles, you'll see that there's almost like a concluding statement to John's gospel straight after this passage. It says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." It's thought that chapter 21 was written also by John, but like as a bit of an addition afterwards. But it's in all of the earliest manuscripts. There's no doubt about it being like it is where it should be. But it seems like John intended this story about Thomas to be like the last story at the end of his kind of gospel about Jesus, almost like the pinnacle or the kind of the concluding thing. In music, we kind of like build up, we create all this drama to build up to the payoff, the chorus, the kind of the big moment. And it's like for John, it seems like this story is the big moment. It demonstrates something about us, about belief, about faith, about people grappling with faith in Jesus. I think there's something in this that is much more than just a story about a guy who doubted that Jesus was really risen from the dead. It shows the journey of someone who is, I think, justifiably skeptical, from that to someone who's committed their life to Jesus. It shows the impact of Jesus' intention to lead someone along that journey through that process. It's a conclusion of much of John's theme. Throughout his gospel, there's a theme of faith and belief. I mean, we could talk about the nature of faith and belief for a long time. We could do a whole sermon series about it all. We could see how many times Jesus actually commended people for their faith. You've been healed because of your faith. There's all sorts of things we could talk about. In John's gospel, in particular in this passage, there's a moment about that kind of centers or kind of focuses in on this topic about faith. And Jesus says to Thomas, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." That's you and I. You believe in Jesus. Blessed are you who have not seen the physical risen Jesus, but yet still have believed. But does this mean, as often we've talked about, or perhaps in some church cultures, that Jesus is expecting some kind of blind faith from people? Does the Gospel of John and Jesus just encourage just kind of blind faith? I don't think that's really true. I think the truth is actually far more interesting and nuanced. Thomas's interaction with Jesus reveals that faith begins with considering a number of things that could be the foundation of believing in something. Testimony, the witness of other people, evidence. It's interesting, isn't it? That faith isn't just kind of like sits by itself without kind of having some kind of foundation in witness and evidence. But actually there's something that we can add on top of that foundation. That there's always like this sense that people around us, or maybe you've even experienced this. Have you ever heard someone say, like, "Oh man, if God would just prove himself, I'd believe in him. If only I could see just the evidence or the kind of proof that God would just prove that, and then I'll be okay. I believe it." The trouble with that is that often in the scriptures, in the Gospels in particular, there are those who were shown signs and miracles, but actually that didn't by themselves produce belief in Jesus, or produce a change of life, or produce recognition that Jesus was Savior and Lord, and kind of that produced a kind of a desire in someone to follow them and commit their life to them. In fact, the witness of the Gospels is that sometimes people had direct proof and it didn't change much. But what faith is that the evidence and witness and testimony always take us so far along the journey, but it doesn't take us all the way. And there's a gap at the end between what you have that's tangible and what's intangible and unseen. And Jesus asks us to trust him for the things that we don't see. In a funny way, there's all sorts of analogies we could use for this. Like when I was at university, my dad would come and pick me up at the end of a semester, take me home. This was before the days of, this is a long time ago, before cell phones, before you could track somebody on your phone, before all that sort of stuff. And in a sense, it's like I had evidence that my dad was going to turn up. I mean, he's a pretty dependable guy. He often, he would leave at a particular time. We'd arranged that. I'd be expecting him. There's lots of evidence in all that sort of stuff. But there were things that I didn't have evidence for. Like I didn't know whether on the journey he would have some kind of breakdown in his car or an accident or some kind of weather event would distract him. There are things that were unseen, right? Does that make sense? Waiting for him to come, there was things that were seen, witness, experience, dependability, faithfulness. But there are things that were unseen. But what was my reaction? For me, this is a picture of faith. It's, I'm going to pack my bags and I'm going to wait for the door because I'm confident he's going to arrive. And I see faith in the Gospels explained like that. And Thomas was confronted by this idea that all his friends had seen the risen Jesus. Jesus has stood amongst them. And his friends told him, we've seen the risen Jesus. But there was a gap. Thomas could trust in their testimony, but there was a gap of faith where he needed to trust what wasn't seen, what he didn't experience. I think that's something that we should be conscious of in the way that faith works, which is that it's not just about kind of just trying harder to believe in something. It's actually this combination of knowing that there are things that we can count as evidence, things that we can count on in witness and testimony, in the word that's been described to us, the stories of people that we know. And our faith is actually trusting God for the gap between that and the things that he presents to us, the things that are unseen. So faith isn't the absence of questions. It's the willingness to commit trust despite the unseen. So what about our framework that we were mentioning? 3 things that we can pick out. Let's have a deep satisfaction. There's 3 things. There's this thing about noticing how Jesus interacts with people that shows the character of God. Noticing how people respond to him, that kind of inspires us in our response to Jesus. And then also kind of this, how do we represent Jesus to people around us? Well, the first thing is what do we see in the character of Jesus as he encounters Thomas? Well, I think that there's something to be said about the fact that even though Thomas missed the first appearance, so he wasn't with everybody, like when Jesus first appeared to them in that room, that Jesus actually returns again. And I would also perhaps boldly say that Jesus returns specifically for Thomas. That Thomas was there and Jesus returned to encounter him and to present himself to him, knowing what Thomas had said. That says something, right? Jesus was aware of what Thomas had said. Unless I can touch his hands, unless I can put my hand in, Jesus heard all that, knew all that. And then appeared specifically in that group when Thomas was there to present himself. Hey, Thomas, here's your opportunity to do what you need to do. Jesus pursues the one who struggles. It says something profoundly about God. God doesn't just move only towards the most confident. He also moves towards the people who are most conflicted. That's what this story tells us. God is not irritated by people who are sincere seekers of him. I don't think Thomas's feelings were, I can imagine myself in his situation and feeling the things that Thomas felt. And I don't think that his questions were out of rebellion or a desire not to believe. They were just genuinely, I want to know. I want to experience. I want to encounter. I want to have the same thing that you did, that you witnessed him, and I want to witness him too. And I want to touch him, and I want to experience him. That God doesn't get irritated by people who are sincerely trying to seek him and are after him. We can imagine, perhaps, didn't know who God was, that Jesus could have dismissed Thomas's questions as resistant or faithless, but instead he accommodates his weakness without abandoning truth. Jesus loved Thomas enough to meet him where he's at, but also loved him enough not to just leave him there. The other thing that is interesting in all this is that Jesus is patient. Well, as we see in the story, it was actually an entire week from the first moment that Jesus appeared to the disciples to this encounter we're kind of reading about today. There's a tremendous patience that Jesus has that, I don't know about you, but like whenever something occurs, a problem or a challenge or something that needs answering, that there's an anxiety in me that kind of desperately wants just to kind of solve it and kind of answer it and just kind of get it out of the way, and then we're all good. And perhaps that's just me that feels that way. But in this story, we see that Jesus is patient enough to wait until the right moment when they're all gathered together again. Thomas lives for an entire week, uncertain, unconvinced, emotionally unresolved, but yet Jesus still comes at the right moment. I think that speaks powerfully to any of us who feel stuck in our circumstance or stuck spiritually. God's silence doesn't necessarily mean God's absence. So that's also something powerful about the Lord, but what does it say? What can we see from Thomas's response that can inspire us? I think there's one thing I want to pick out of this. There's a few, but there's one thing in particular I think is powerful and good for us, is that Thomas, in the process, stayed in community. And if you notice that, again, we've got this kind of first encounter where he's not there and the second encounter where he is. But I think we sometimes overlook that. A week later, Thomas is still with the disciples. Even in doubt, he stayed connected. Even in this kind of like emotional turmoil that he had, he still stayed connected and in community. You know, people often assume that doubt means that we would withdraw or isolate or disconnect from church or detach from believers. And I think if you're anything like me, you've probably known that happen to people that we know and love who, for whatever reason, when they've gone through a season where they've been doubting or had questions, that they've kind of, in the midst of that, been tempted to withdraw and to isolate and to disconnect. But actually what we see from Thomas is the opposite. He struggles honestly, but he stays in the room. He stays with people. He stays connected. He stays in community. I think there's something about that would be challenging to us, but I think needs to inspire us. That no matter what you're going through, to still stay connected with people, to still stay connected to community, to worship. You know, the truth of it is that probably when you least feel like going to church, it's probably the best time to go. I love this little story of like, there's a guy, it's a joke, it's not a true story, but I like to kind of lead into it as though it's a true story. There's a guy who said to his wife, whenever I'm around that group of people, like they're just nasty to me. They're rude, they're discouraging. I just don't really want to be there anymore, and I don't want to be around those people. And his wife said, well, you're the pastor, so you probably should do something like that. That's not my experience, of course. You know, there's something about church culture that I just want to notice this idea that Thomas was allowed to be in that place while still doubting, while still honest about his struggles. And if we're not careful, we can build a church culture that sometimes rewards kind of pretending. Do you know what I mean? That actually, like, we just want you to pretend to be certain about your faith, or to pretend to be strong while you're around us, or to pretend not to be going through stuff, or to just put on spiritual confidence when you're around us. We don't see that in this particular community. That Thomas's presence was valued no matter what he was going through. In his doubt, in his uncertainty, in his need. There was no rejection of him, that he was allowed to still be there. And then Jesus actually comes and meets him in that place. I long for us to be a church, and I think we're not. I'm not saying we aren't. But I think a value of us is that we could not just reward people for pretending that they're okay when they're not. That we would allow people to be honest and express where they're at without judgment, and that we would still stay connected to people. For us, whoever go through times when we have questions or doubts, my encouragement to you is just, resist that desire to disconnect and to withdraw, but push forward, push in. There's people here that I know are absolutely okay with honesty and being real and actually walking through the journey. And can I also encourage you, church, that sometimes what people need isn't necessarily the precise answer to a problem. Sometimes people just need your presence. And that's what matters. What can we do to represent Jesus well? As we look at this scenario, kind of following on from the same point about Thomas's honesty and his struggle, I'm going to say something that for me is a little bit bold, but I'm going to go with it anyway. My conviction is that we represent Jesus poorly when we shame questions. What I mean by that is that, like, there are certain church cultures, or sometimes as Christians we can get into this place where we just don't acknowledge people's heartfelt and honest questions about faith and about Jesus and about the Bible and about walking this out. I don't think we represent Jesus well when we in any way kind of like give a message that it's not okay to question things. Just have faith. Don't have that question, because that question's, just have faith, and that's what you're supposed to do. Actually, I think that this story shows us that Jesus didn't humiliate Thomas. Like he corrects Thomas, but he does it relationally and compassionately. Like it suggests that moment was a safe place for Thomas to express his doubts and to interact with Jesus. I think, again, I just long for the church to become a safe place for seekers, a safe place for wounded believers, a safe place for difficult questions. And I think, I just want to be really honest, is that, like, even though I've been a Christian for a long time, there are still things I have questions about, that I'm still pursuing Jesus about, looking for answers to. I haven't yet understood fully the entirety of the eternal character of the Lord who created the heavens and the earth. Surprise. So I think there's more still. I think anyone who's honestly dealing with things, there are difficult scriptures, there are difficult concepts, there are things that perhaps we work through. And I just want to say that, like, that's one way we can represent Jesus well, is that actually he's present in this moment with somebody who is doubting, who is working through stuff, who has questions about things. And do you notice something about this story? This is what kind of like I noticed afresh when I was looking through it and preparing for this sermon, was that, like, what Thomas said? He said, I want to touch Jesus. I want to touch his hands. I want to put my hand in his side. Did he do that? If you look at the passage carefully, you'll see that he didn't. He didn't need to. As soon as he encountered Jesus, and as soon as Jesus kind of like invited him, he actually just had that moment of realization of who Jesus really was. And then he confessed, not just, you are God, you are a God, you are the God, but what? My God. You are my God, my Lord, and my God. Presence matters. Jesus' presence in that moment matters. And I think that if you want to represent Jesus well, that's something I think you can do. Sometimes you might find that maybe that's hard at times, but I think what we can do is be present for people. But I think actually my experience is that, like, it's not always about, again, like, it's, yes, absolutely, we should be confident in our faith, ready to give a reason for why we believe, and have great discussions with people. But actually, sometimes what people want is just the presence of somebody who can actually listen to them in what they're going through and what they're kind of digging through. And there are people all around us who are like that, who are thinking deeply, especially in this moment. This moment right now, there are things happening in the world that are causing people to think more deeply about kind of, is there something deeper going on? Is there something bigger than all of this? Is there something that I've missed? And the discussions around faith and spirituality are happening afresh again at a deeper level in different places. And we can represent Jesus well when we're just present to people and actually just honest with our journey and honest with our testimony. Like, that's my experience as well. Is often, there was a guy, I used to work at the bank, and I won't tell you the things he said to me, but he came from a Christian family, so he knew the typical things that would kind of provoke somebody who was a Christian. He would say outrageously rude and disgusting things to me to try and provoke me and get me kind of like riled up. But actually, deep down beneath it all, and he had a crazy life. He was a financial advisor. He was still married to his wife. He was then also kind of in a relationship with another woman who had just become pregnant. And he was just like, hey, Simon, what do you think about this? You know, knowing full well that the church would, like, you know, disagree with that or condemn that or whatever it is. But the bottom line of it all was beneath all that, or kind of beneath the surface, he was a guy who just had a lot of questions. And really, for me, it was just about, there's a stubbornness in my character that I like to say is actually not stubbornness, it's just I'm firm in my convictions. The Lord's still working on that with me. But I do like to be unflappable in situations. So the fact that, like, I would stay kind of in conversation with him and still stay present to him, like, actually mattered a whole lot more than just having answers for the things that he proposed. So I want to end with this. I want to just end with this phrase or this kind of idea. Don't let doubt keep you from your destiny. Say that again. Don't let doubt keep you from your destiny. Yeah, I think that, when we say destiny, what does that mean? I want to say destiny on multiple levels. Destiny meaning the future possibility of what God wants to do with you. What he wants to do with you, what he wants to do in you, and what he wants to do through you. I think the Lord has a desire to kind of, wherever you're at right now and in the future, that he's got things in mind for you as part of his kingdom. And if you're not careful, doubt can come in and derail that. Doubt's going to happen. I don't want to just proclaim that over you, but I think for most people, like, doubt at some point is part of your journey. But when you deal with doubt, it can take you in a couple of different directions. It can lead you to a place of disconnection, a place away from the Lord, or it actually, believe it or not, can lead you to a deeper place of faith and connection with the Lord. But working through that with him and with other people can actually lead to a place where you're more confident and more sure of who he is and his place in your life. So I would just say to you that when those doubts come, or when we see them in others, or when other people are honest enough to express them to us, that we can help or be a part of the Lord ministering to those people, to shepherd those moments carefully and intentionally, to lead people towards Jesus and towards faith. They can also lead us to a stronger and deeper faith and commitment to him. Come in. This happened a few weeks ago as well. So I just want to end with this, that if you're either somebody who's having doubts or processing through things like Thomas is or was, get in community, talk to people that you feel you can trust, and pray with the full confidence that Jesus is actually not threatened by how you feel and your questions you have, but actually he wants to be present to you in the midst of all that. And we can also represent him by being present to those in the same space. Would you pray with us? Would you pray with me?